everyone. Thank you so very much for joining us this evening. My name is Gray Williams. I'm the Chief Security Officer for Burwood, and our guest this evening is Adam Rice, who is the Global Chief Security Officer for Cubic Corporation. Adam has 20 years of experience in information technologies and information security. He has built numerous security programs for a number of different industry verticals, most recently for global defense manufacturers, telecommunications carriers, and security service providers. As CSO, Adam oversees and coordinates all security efforts across the enterprise, both cyber and physical. He is responsible for identifying, evaluating, and reporting on strategic security risks in a manner that meets strict compliance, regulatory, and enterprise risk management requirements. Adam was also in the United States Army. From 1983 to 2007, he was a team sergeant for the U.S. Army Special Forces, A Detachment, and he served the combat tour in Afghanistan. He holds a master's degree in public administration from George Mason University of Virginia, as well as postgraduate work in information security management from the University of Virginia. He's a published author of both books as well as numerous articles on information security. Please welcome Adam this evening.
It's good to be here.
You were first CSO for a global telecommunications carrier, and as a consultant, you built programs for a wide number of industry verticals. Cubic now makes the second time you've worked for a defense industrial. Is there something about this vertical that makes it different from or unique from a security perspective?
I think that it is obvious. We have threats that are certainly what you hear about in the news. We're targets of APT. Everybody knows I'll use the word APT. I use APT to describe nation state or cyber espionage groups, the Russians and the Chinese and all the usual suspects. And I think that the defense vertical has historically attracted these kinds of adversaries where transportation, telecommunications, more criminal kinds of threats. So that's not to say that there aren't other industry verticals that do attract the attention of nation state or nation-sponsored bad guys, but the defense industry obviously does, right? Famously.
So APT, Advanced Persistent Threat.
Advanced Persistent Threat, it's a term that was coined in the early 2000s by an Air Force colonel. The guy's name kind of escapes me, but APT is kind of recognized as the term for nation-state actors, though I have been noticing that criminal elements are doing what works, and they are using a lot of the techniques and kind of tools and processes that APTs perhaps invented and operationalized. So there is a blurring of the line there.
You wrote about that in an article called The Anatomy and Physiology of APT, where you also wrote that when national intelligence services began using these hacker tools and techniques that, quote, nothing in our past has happened so quickly or with as far-reaching implications and dependencies. What did you mean by that?
I think that when governments got in the business of kind of getting their intelligence services into the electromagnetic space, as our global civilization has moved in my lifetime, certainly from a non-networked world, in a single direction within a period of time that is, in the bigger scheme of things, remarkable. I mean, we could no sooner give up our networked world as we could electricity at this point. And long ago, the days of a guy in a fedora and a trench coat under some lamp outside taking numbers down, right? The old spy stuff, that's gone, right? It exists, but I think that when national security organizations really kind of, that light bulb went off and said, that everything that we need to steal in the defense world or finance or whatever they wanted, it's all there. It's all on this network, right? And from my computer in Lubyanka Square, I have a physical connection to that computer in Lockheed Martin that's building the stealth bomber. And when that epiphany happened, things began to happen quickly. And cyber defense, I think, had about 10 years of catch up. And before we even knew what to look at, companies, at least in the US defense industry, were being looted by the Chinese and the Russians, Iran and they didn't even see it. And then once people began to recognize what we call now IOCs, indicators of compromise, and TTPs and other things, and threat intelligence became the center of an active cyber defense, suddenly everybody was seeing something that they hadn't seen before, and it was an amazing amount of data left US defense companies and went overseas before anybody even knew how to stop it.
So in April of this year, you wrote another paper on the risk that industry faces due to the politics of cyber attribution. First, what is attribution? And then what are those risks?
So attribution is whodunit, right? In my business as a defense company, we really use cyber threat intelligence as our pivot against all of our APT defense. And that attribution is groups, and you've heard them called APT-1. Mandiant called them APT-1, the Chinese, but Fancy Bear and Jade Panda, and they have all these clever names. But APT groups are collected until you begin to get a commonality in techniques, processes, and indicators of compromise. And once you begin to see a pattern emerge, if they get tight enough, then they spawn their own little APT group. So we manage our indicators of compromise by country, by actor within the country. The Russians, for instance, have two big groups using the FireEye Mandiant kind of vernacular. It's APT 28 and 29. APT 28 is an arm of their military intelligence, where APT 29 is an extension of the FSB, or previously called the KGB. And for us to protect against these guys who are capitalized in billions of dollars, their budgets are to come and take our stuff. And my budget is not as big as their budget, right? So for me to effectively protect our data against any Russian or Chinese, any nation state actor, I need to focus that on threat intelligence. I need to know what it looks like. Indicators of compromise, and that list is long and complicated. And the sources of that threat intelligence, when you're a cleared defense contractor, can come from the US government. The Department of Defense has the Defense Cyber Crime Center, DC3, and the Defense Industrial Base, or DIB. And I'm cleared with a top secret clearance. We have a secret portal into their stuff. And we can get up to cleared secret threat intelligence directly from the government as a member of the DIB. But when it comes to attribution, especially in the current political world, if you have a problem with Russia and you go running to the DIB saying, we think we have a Russian problem, please give us everything you have on APT 28, for political considerations, very quickly that threat intelligence or attribution, official attribution, that they are playing naughty games is classified at top secret. So suddenly it becomes unavailable. You can't get it, right? Even though they're actively trying to steal our stuff because of the election with Trump and all of this innuendo about the Russians playing and all that, it becomes a politically sensitive issue. And I have noticed that classification level, when it comes to attribution, has a very large geopolitical component to it. It became popular to out the Chinese about 5 years ago, and all the IOCs became secret or less, and they just flooded. Everybody can see the Chinese now. But if I went to the government to get IOCs on a frenemy, like France or Israel or another country, they would not give that to us.
During Sony's travails from a few years ago, Dan Kaminsky, who was part of that conversation, and he's the chief scientist and chief technology officer of White Ops. He argued pretty vehemently that definitive attribution is nearly impossible.
I would disagree.
So why would you disagree?
I think that if you look at there are private companies that are in the business of cyber threat intelligence, specifically around APTs, and there are more getting into the line of work every day. The old grandfather of this line of work was Mandiant. before they were bought by FireEye, and they really kind of were the only player in town for many years. And then CrowdStrike is now in the game. Palo Alto's getting into it. And the way that you can do this attribution all the way back to Shanghai is typically, if you are attacked and your data is leaving the network, it's not going to go straight to Shanghai, right? It's going to hop, skip, and a jump. But you have the forensics to know where that next hop is, and if you sit on that hop spot, you're going to find out where the next hop is. And you can walk the dog back to the People's Liberation Army headquarters building in Shanghai, as Mandiant did when they outed APT1 after the New York Times hack. I mean, they really laid it out where they were able to deconstruct the malware and walk the dog all the way back to the front door of that building. And I would call that 100% attribution.
If it is possible then for attribution, right now the U.S., to my understanding, and this is per Senator Angus King, who is, I believe he's on both the Select Intelligence Committee and the Armed Services Committee, has stated that there is no definition of what constitutes an act of war in cyber. And largely that was due to the difficulties of definitive attribution. So you think that if we can attribute these things, then why would we not have a definition of what a cyber act of war would be?
I think that, and we're speaking to an American audience pretty much here, and this conversation usually gets a bit weirder when you have a very international group, right? But the thing is that I put blocks on our network against the Equation Group and the NSA, just like I do the Chinese and the Russians. And the thing is my company is a bystander in this great game, right? Our NSA is probably the best at this kind of field craft. The Russians are very good. The Chinese, not as much in my experience. But what we do is our government will just, they just say, shocked I am that the Russians are getting involved in an election, right? And the people in Chile and Guatemala and all these other places are rolling their eyes like, really?
Latvia, Lithuania.
And the list goes on, right? So what we cry about, America actively participates in continuously and does a very good job of it. My understanding of it is that our NSA is among the best at playing these games, and it is the great game that nation states play with each other. It's really not the rule of law. We can indict people. We've done that before with some Chinese people in the People's Liberation Army. We indicted them and so on, but it doesn't rise to an act of war to spy on each other. It's what countries do. Now, I would say if they went in and crippled a portion of our electrical grid, that might rise to the occasion. And I would be worried that would certainly be a precursor to a kinetic war, would be a cyber attack that would be destructive in nature rather than just stealing stuff, right?
That sounds very much in line with what Richard Clark, who is the former National Coordinator for Security Infrastructure Protection and Counterterrorism under the Bush administration, has said, that a cyber war is likely to end in a physical war. But of course, first you have to have that definition. And I think you put it rather eloquently that in the great game, the United States is certainly a player, if not the player.
I would like to think, being an American, that we're the best at it. I mean, if I got to pick a side.
Speaking of the United States and the great game and cybersecurity, so Sean McGurk, I'm not sure if that name rings a bell. He's the former director of DHS's cyber's, I believe I'm pronouncing this right, NKIC, called Stuxnet, a Trinity Moment. And what he meant by that was after the New Mexico atomic explosion tests, because the destruction, so Stuxnet, which, first of all, tell us what Stuxnet was.
Stuxnet was an incredibly clever piece of malware. Besides its sophistication and just the grace of how it was put together. And the way that it was targeting, it targeted a Siemens industrial controller that ran the centrifuges for the Iranians' plutonium enrichment. And it was delivered by just dropping thumb drives around, because their industrial network was air-gapped, and people went to cafes and they picked these things up and walked them in the building. So if you think about just the risk that people walking around the Islamic Republic of Iran are doing with these things in their pocket, right? You get caught, you die. But the industrial controllers exploited a couple 0 days, or Microsoft unpublished feature sets, as they like to call them. And while the centrifuges are hopping and skipping down the floor, burning themselves to pieces, the controllers like everything's great, right? And it also self-propagated. So once in, it would look for other controllers, and then it would self-replicate it. So it had a worm component as well. And it was apparently just hugely successful. It just wrecked their plutonium enrichment for a while.
Well, and that's the key, because the destruction of the Iranian centrifuges was so complete.
I'd call that an act of war. I would say that's getting close.
Well, that's exactly what
right?
What Kim Zetter of Wired wrote, that Stuxnet, and Shamoon, which didn't get as much
Shamoon
press,
was just a derivative of Stuxnet,
which destroyed 85% of all Saudi Aramco's, which is the oil company of Saudi Arabia.
Which ironically is Iran going back in their religious strife between Sunni and Shia.
Right.
So Iran's launching these Shamu attacks into the Sunni Muslims, not to steal stuff, but to break it.
And as she wrote, these were acts of war without the war. That Stuxnet opened a door that many countries have now since ran through it at top speed.
Yeah.
And this has spurred them, specifically the destruction of Iranian centrifuges and the destruction of Saudi Arabia IT infrastructure, demonstrated the physical impact of cyber. And that's why, as I mentioned, Sean McGurk called it as Trinity Moment, because you're representing the physical impact of a cyber threat.
Right, because if they steal your stuff, they're stealing a copy, right? Typically, you lose data, it's a copy of data. You still have your data. I have lived through many data breaches involving APTs, and we always had the original data. It was typically copies of the data. So the impact on us was reputational. We had to report it to the US government and so on. But if those same people, after they stole the data, went ahead and wrecked, like destroyed the hard drives or somehow wrecked our network, the impact would have been unimaginable.
I love your phraseology of the great game. How much of today's cyber threat landscape is due to the great game, these competing nation states competing in? Is it fair to call it a cyber arms race?
I don't think that the analogy with an arms race is probably as accurate, that the cost of entry into APT is not as high. You don't have to have big manufacturing. You just need to have people who have computer science degrees. And you can buy zero-day vulnerabilities. There are companies that just fuzz operating systems and will sell you that stuff. Most of the things, I mean, you saw what happened with WannaCry, right? That ransomware, the vulnerabilities with WannaCry were part of the Shadow Brokers release. Microsoft issued a patch the day that hit the wild, and a month later, the National Health Service of the UK is cratered, FedEx is cratered, and all this. So I don't think you need to be so clever to do a lot of damage. I think there are a lot of companies walking around with their pants down every day, and they need that moment to probably fire some people and get serious. So I don't think you need to be terribly clever. I think a lot of commodity malware still is very effective. What you do and nation states do is they have these precious thing called zero-day vulnerabilities that are unknown. And when they burn one of those, of course, then they are known. But I promise you, every big player in the APT space has a couple of those in their war chest to use on a very important target. And it's very hard to protect against that.
So you mentioned earlier that these groups are funded to take our stuff and
or break our stuff.
Or break. And so it's actually, these APT groups are actually set up like business units. They're set, I mean, they have business justifications. How does that process work where an organization decides, how do they decide what to go after and whether or not?
It's not, if you've been in the intel business, you would recognize it instantly. So the way it works is a guy will go to they'll go to the Paris Air Show, right? They represent the government of China. They'll go to the Paris Air Show and they'll see a radar or an aircraft or a novel technology that they could not buy because of arms export regulations out of the US, or it would just be very hard to buy or license that technology, or maybe they don't want to, but they will take pictures. When I worked at ATK and we were at the Paris Air Show, we would have people, and maybe I'm paranoid, but they would, on their jackets, it looked like rulers, and they would stand next to mock-ups of our technology with like a ruler next to it and take the pictures, right? And then they go back and they say, hey, we really want this stuff. And it goes straight into their intelligence organization and apparatus. They prioritize the collection. They just do what they did in the traditional old spy days. And then they say, okay, we're going to steal this stuff from ATK. And then they begin their research on the company. They do all the open source stuff. They start getting some spearfishes together. They do their research, and then they begin the campaign to try to steal it.
So they make a shopping list.
Yes, I believe they do.
And then the military, well, one thing that I think in the West that we don't appreciate as much is that in China, the CPC, which is the Communist Party, they have an office in your business. So on the top floor, the party representative is there. And there is such a direct line into the Communist Party, which controls that military. And so you put in your shopping list and you say, here's what it's worth. You do your 2-page business case, and then they take that back and they say, okay, is this worth the 0 days that we're going to use to get it?
Right.
Or perhaps we don't even need a 0 day because that organization
hasn't
patched or hasn't put in place. Okay.
China has gone quiet. Obama went to visit China, and the day he left, Chinese APT activity across the defense industry went way down. We don't hardly ever see the Chinese anymore.
China's not the only one, of course. Iran recently was considered to be the 4th strongest in the world in terms of cyber armies, their cyber defense command.
Yes.
North Korea's Unit 121 and Office 91. Hezbollah, ISIS even.
The Syrian Electronic Army. I have experience with the Iranians, also called Ajax crew. And they like social engineering as kind of their sweet spot. They social engineer you, they get their target lists. There was a LinkedIn profile for Maria Altamez, was her name. And a lot of people at the last company I worked for, just beautiful picture of this, woman who was a doctorate in astrophysics, totally fake kind of LinkedIn profile. And a lot of guys linked with her. They got everybody's home email addresses and then nailed everyone's home computer with malware. And then when they came to work using remote access, they were able to jump in that way.
You were in India at the time of the Mumbai attacks on the Taj.
We worked together at an Indian company. I got to Mumbai when the building was still on fire.
And I think one of the things that shook me the most after reading about that, the terrorists that were walking through that hotel had a gun in one hand and a phone in the other. It was a smartphone.
Yep.
And they literally borrowed from the IT model of having a support center, wherein they could go room by room, take a photo of the individual that was cowering in that room, talk to their support center,
see if they would kill him or not,
to try and identify who that person was. And there are recorded conversations where the terrorist is saying, well, he's saying he's a teacher. Well, is he Is he bald? Is he of a certain weight? Does he look like this? And they would send back a picture either from LinkedIn or Facebook, and they made the identification, and then the command came from that operations center, kill him.
Kill him.
So my question to you,
Yep.
as CSO, you're responsible for physical security, strategic security, as well as cyber. How, in this environment, from a policy perspective, are you incorporating this into your risk management program? Do you restrict social media in some way to protect your?
We do a lot of awareness training. We let our employees know that our adversaries use social media as a way to get into the company and to get, even individually, social media is a conduit for more of the criminal element to steal your social security number. So we do that kind of awareness training on a continuous basis. I don't know if you're asking, do we have contingency plans against terrorist actions that would involve our employees?
Yes, but
We have 350 employees and dependents that are working for U.S. Forces Korea in Seoul right now. And we're sending 5 Iridium phones with unlimited SIMs, and we're talking to an airline or charter to see, what would our options be? I mean, what do we do? We've got 300 family members and employees who live in Korea full time. And what do we do if the balloon goes up, right? Or we think it's going to go up, or maybe there's indicators that, hey, now would be a good time to do a voluntary evacuation.
Now
and that's hard. It's hard to predict the future.
Now, you have a particular experience set where you're a little closer to this than probably anyone that I've ever met. And in about a month, we're going to hit November 21st.
Yep.
And so where were you 38 years ago?
Long time ago. November 21st, 1979, I lived in Islamabad, Pakistan. I think I was a long-haired 16-year-old dependent of State Department. My parents were both in the State Department. And the hostages had just been taken in Iran, and a crowd formed and burnt the U.S. Embassy down, very big embassy compound. They killed a friend of mine. He was shot in the head. Another American burnt to death, and then they showed up at the school. When we were at school, they had held us at the school, and I saw the tops of the buses full of these guys stop. I couldn't see over the wall, but I could see the top of the buses, and I was like, buses? And then all these guys start coming over the wall. And I can honestly say in my whole life, I do not believe I've run faster. I remember running and telling myself, I'm running faster now than I ever will in my whole life. But it was troubling. We had to hide. I got hurt. I had my arm smashed. People were dying. There's fire. And we ended up getting evacuated.
So that had to be an incredibly formative experience.
I thought it was very exciting.
Really?
I did.
So a couple years later, you graduate high school, and then
I joined the Army.
Did that experience, looking back, did that have
Absolutely.
anything?
Very much part of the motivation. Because I had revenge on my mind.
So how long after boot camp did you get past selection?
I was what they called a Special Forces baby. So I went straight from basic training, straight into the Special Forces pipeline. Because Reagan was president, they were opening up, they were growing the military. Usually you had to be on your second enlistment, a couple other things. So I went straight in to the Special Forces training and was just too stupid to quit. And I think it took me a year and a half or 2 years, and then I graduated out the other end of the pipeline and was assigned to 5th Special Forces Group, the Legion. It's the best group of all.
If we think about a Venn diagram where you have these bubbles of digital security, cybersecurity, you have physical security, and then you have national security. You are sort of in this interesting nexus where you've lived it. as a warfighter. You've lived it as a citizen who has had your security put at risk due to national security or competing national security interests.
Yep. No, it's been a pretty good ride so far.
Leon Panetta, who was the former defense secretary and the CIA director, ex-CIA director, he warned not long after the Stuxnet event that the U.S. faced a cyber Pearl Harbor. And then this was recently echoed by former NATO Supreme Allied Commander James Stavridis. What's your reaction to this, given your unique perspective, your experience set?
I would say that if you said that 5 years ago, I would say that we were a lot closer to that Pearl Harbor event. I think in the last 5 years, I think that cybersecurity, certainly from the defensive way, I'm not talking these APT units, I'm talking about defending yourself. I think that the ways and means and how to structure your teams and the types of things that you need to put in place to effectively defend against advanced types of threats, and this could be if you run the electric grid or a nuclear power plant or you're a defense company, it's kind of industry agnostic. I would say that mystery has been solved. And I would say that if you are in a critical piece of infrastructure, that the ISACs or the information security, that threat intelligence sharing infrastructure is being put in place and is pretty effective against most things. So I don't think someone's going to wake up one day in a piece of critical infrastructure and see that it's game over. Now, I don't know. I would say that if it is, it would be because people aren't doing what they know they could have done. But I think 5 years ago, people were helpless because they had no idea how to stop these guys. And now there is a way to stop them. I'm not saying that our network is impervious, but I'm telling you that it would be hard to get into our network.
So hard to get into your network.
Now I'm going to get a call tonight. Right.
hard to get into your network, but according to the most recent cloud report this June, the average number of cloud applications being used within the common enterprise has now gone over 1,000. As more and more companies place more of their critical infrastructure both on the internet and into the cloud, how does private, at the same time that we've talked about competing national security interests who are building up offensive cyber capabilities that have the ability to impact both the physical as well as the digital, how does private industry manage that risk?
I don't think they do a very good job. I think that a lot of people think that when they outsource or push stuff up into the cloud, either as platform as a service or infrastructure as a service or even software as a service, that somehow they've also outsourced the risk and responsibility for that data. Now, certainly the model changes, and if you use software as a service, there is the leap of faith that your provider is going to do what the terms and conditions say. And you have some diligence, you have to make sure that you do what is expected on your side, which is primarily access control and making sure that you have non-regional backups and a bunch of other stuff. But to your point, would it be completely inconceivable that a nefarious group could get into Amazon Web Services' background global management plane and wreck the whole thing? You know, it'd be unlikely, but would it be impossible? And that would be a big deal if all of Amazon Web Services just turned off tomorrow. I mean,
Salesforce, ServiceNow.
I mean, it would be a really big deal.
Yeah.
Like a.
Well, let's talk a little bit about solutions then. Ransomware and malicious code outbreaks have been in this year's headlines almost nonstop.
Yep.
In a paper that you wrote earlier this year about threats like WannaCry, you closed by saying that the issues leading up to these events are complex. Obviously, we've talked about a lot of complexity here, but the solutions are fairly straightforward. Could you explain what you meant by that?
I mean, everybody knows the cure to WannaCry, right? It's patch. So I get it if you got hit by WannaCry, maybe if that worm was released the day the patch was released, then maybe you would have some impact. But I used WannaCry as a very good example. The cure to that worm, SMB version 2, is two things. Either turn that off, but if you use Samba and other legacy technologies, you can't, or just apply the patch, right? I mean, you couldn't even say that you have XP and other unsupported systems on your network as an excuse, because Microsoft even did the extraordinary task of releasing a patch for non-supported OSs. So if you are in my shoes and you get stomped by a serious vulnerability that is over a month old because you're exposing SMB to the internet, which is a mistake, and you haven't applied your patch, you failed your company, right? I don't see, I mean, when now, sounds right, but I was like on my knees praying that this thing was going to just pass over our company, right? Because maybe it's just one or two machines, and then they grab the shares and they can take off and stuff. But if you don't do the basics, if you don't do just those things that you see in ISO 27001 and 2, right? Not to say that if you do everything like that, you still couldn't have a problem the next day. You could, but you certainly need to keep the basics in mind: patch management, vulnerability management, configuration control. All of those things will take you a lot farther down the road than most people recognize, I think.
What's the hardest part about building that? So you've come into now a number of different organizations. What is the hardest part as CISO about building a new program that does those basics?
Know the truth and it shall set you free. So what I did is, when I came in and joined, I had a KPI, a key performance indicator, that we wanted on a 30-day rotational basis greater than 98% patch currency across our enterprise. Because it's a journey, right? You're never going to finish patching. It's going to be a continuous thing. So I said we needed to have 98% patch currency, and I always have a report or a document that goes upstairs to the people who own the corporate risk, the CEO, the CIO, CFO. They all get my report. And where there is a problem, I say we're not meeting the patching requirement. I don't own the people who do the patching. I tell the CIO you need to patch, and if it's not a priority, then I go upstairs and say, look, here's the risk that you're going to undertake if you do not do this, and it's your risk, but I'm telling you what it is. And if you choose to not take it seriously, then the consequences are, I'm not trying to just say it's not my bad, but I think that what you have to do in my position to be effective is articulate in a business kind of vernacular what kind of risk people are incurring by not doing things like that. And if you tell them, hey, all the stars line up and we get smoked by ransomware, we might lose a lot of data, and we're certainly going to be down for a day or two while we try to restore. Or maybe we got to get a Bitcoin account and pay them.
So how do you prioritize, of all the things you could be doing, how do you prioritize efforts?
It's the crocodile closest to the canoe. That's what you got to keep your eye on, right?
And how do you identify in a corporate environment where
a lot of it is subjective? I always got my eye on APTs because once in, they're going to be a train wreck. But there's been this big rise in criminal activity, pretty sophisticated criminal activity, fraud attempts. A lot of it's commodity, but now they're using malware, sophisticated spear phishing, very focused spear phishing. So that's why you've got to have your ear to what's going on. We're members with these information sharing groups within industry, as well with DoD and the transportation industries, and we're not alone. What they see, we're going to see the next day. What hits us is going to hit them in a couple days. So we stay engaged across the industry, and we have a good sense. We also understand within the kill chain, if we see a lot of domains, Cubic, enterprise.com, all these domains starting to get registered, we know that that's a harbinger of a malware attack that's going to come down the road in a couple months, and we will start paying attention. We'll proactively put those blocks in. We'll see stuff coming down the road. Right now, things are pretty quiet, and so we have guarded optimism, but usually it picks up near Christmas. So,
What do you know today that you wish you knew when you first took on the job of CISO?
Where? At Cubic?
When you first became a CISO, if the Adam Rice of today could go back and talk to the Adam Rice on day one of becoming a CISO, what do you wish you could tell yourself back then?
Ask for more money.
For you or the or your security organization? Both?
Both.
Both.
No, I think that when I was working at the telco, I think that we really had our stuff put together a bit kludgy. I think I would have focused our efforts a little cleaner towards the risks that in hindsight we had that I didn't have any experience in it, and more money.
How do you know policy? How do you know policy is working? What are you measuring?
So KPIs is the way that you can measure compliance. Policies are in place just so that you can point at it and say, it's not me, it's the policy, go do it. And also our compliance requirements, the ISO and PCI and DFARS and this whole litany require that everything within the maturity model, you have to have written comprehensive processes and policies, and they have to be followed.
Do frameworks help?
Frameworks help because it is what is reasonable, because in the old days when you got a breach, everybody was the victim. We're the victim, you're the victim, it was your data, sorry, but we got breached, we're all victims here. Now the narrative has changed to you didn't do what was reasonable to protect my data, and now a class action lawsuit is going to tear you a new one. So the risk focus has shifted, that organizations that have data that have a compliance standard around them, if you do not do what is reasonable to protect that data and that data gets lost, there is criminal and civil liability that a company and individuals in the company will endure. And if you say that you do what is reasonable, right, stuff happens. But if you're doing what's reasonable, then you have a lot more wiggle room. So going with the ISO standard or NIST 53 or 171 or whatever, by saying that you do follow a framework, then you didn't pick your controls, you let the industry gods of industry pick those for you, and you're following them. Otherwise, you can get in trouble. You get sued.
Are there any last parting thoughts? Any words of advice or counsel that you'd like to give to executives who are struggling with the cybersecurity challenge?
I think that if your organization doesn't, I got hired into Cubic during Cubic is going through a transformation. It was a new CEO, there was a new board. Cyber was something that was on their mind. They wanted us to have a good cyber practice. And so my role is positioned very well in the organization. I report to the board of directors, I report to the CEO, I work for the CIO. I have a grown-up CIO that gets it, that cyber is important. But if the role is not positioned well in the organization, or the organization is paying lip service to it, like, oh, we just need the role, but don't spend any money, and not really interested, my advice would be change jobs, because something bad will happen and then you're going to be holding the water, right? I think if organizations are serious about the role, I think there are a couple good metrics that you can judge. You should get at least 10% of the IT budget should be going to security, right? There's a lot of things that you can measure what you're doing in relationship to the broader company to see if you're doing what's expected, and I would make sure that was the case. It's a hard job, and if it's not positioned well in an organization, or it's treated as an overhead, nobody cares, and everybody can say the same old thing like, oh, you'll save millions by just avoiding one breach. That's kind of hard to kind of qualify when it gets into the guts. So the organization has to want it as part of their DNA to be super successful. And I'm lucky at Cubic, they take cyber very seriously, and I get reasonably what I need to do the job.
Adam, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thanks. Thank you.